December 20th, 1944. The small town of Hearne, Texas, population 3,400, sat in darkness as temperatures dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The main electrical transformer that powered the downtown district had failed 3 days earlier, leaving businesses shuttered and families huddled around fireplaces just 5 days before Christmas. Mayor Thomas Whitfield stood in his unheated office, staring at a stack of telegrams from the state capitol, all bearing the same grim message: no replacement parts available until after the new year. Little did anyone in Hearne know that salvation would come from the most unlikely source imaginable: a prisoner of war held behind barbed wire just 2 miles outside of town. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how Christmas 1944 in Hearne, Texas, would be illuminated not by American ingenuity, but by the forbidden expertise of a man who was supposed to be the enemy. The Camp Hearne prisoner of war facility housed 4,700 German soldiers captured during the campaigns in North Africa and Italy. Built in 1943 on 500 acres of former cotton fields, it represented one of 511 such camps scattered across the United States, part of a massive logistical operation that held over 400,000 German prisoners on American soil. The camp's daily operations required the coordination of 300 American guards, 42 administrative personnel, and a complex supply chain that delivered 18,000 meals per day. Among the prisoners was Hauptmann Klaus Brenner, a 32-year-old electrical engineer from Munich who had served with the Afrika Korps before his capture at El Alamein. Brenner possessed credentials that would have made him invaluable in peacetime: a doctorate in electrical engineering from the Technical University of Munich, 5 years of experience designing power distribution systems for German industrial facilities, and expertise in high-voltage transformers that few men in Texas could match. However, under the Geneva Convention and strict American military protocols, prisoners were forbidden from working on critical infrastructure, especially anything that could be considered military or strategically important. The crisis began on December 17th, when lightning struck during an unusual winter storm. The main transformer serving downtown Hearne, manufactured by Westinghouse in 1938, suffered catastrophic failure in its primary winding assembly. The unit carried a rating of 250 kilovolt amperes and served 43 businesses, including the town's only hospital, 2 schools, and the telephone exchange that connected Hearne to the outside world. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only physician, found herself treating patients by candlelight in the hospital's emergency ward. The 38-year-old graduate of Baylor Medical College had dealt with wartime shortages of medicine and supplies, but operating without electricity presented challenges that threatened lives. Her patient log from December 18th recorded 7 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning from families using improvised heating methods, 3 elderly residents suffering from hypothermia, and 2 premature births complicated by inadequate lighting and sterilization equipment. Meanwhile, at Camp Hearne, Colonel James Patterson faced his own dilemma. The 51-year-old career officer commanded a facility that consumed enormous amounts of electricity for lighting, heating, food preparation, and perimeter security. The camp's backup generators, designed for temporary use, were already straining to maintain essential operations. More critically, the camp's communications equipment and searchlights were drawing power from the same failing grid that served the town. If the electrical situation deteriorated further, security at the facility could be compromised. Patterson reviewed the personnel files of his prisoners, searching for any expertise that might help resolve the crisis. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to volunteer for non-military work, but the line between civilian and strategic infrastructure remained frustratingly unclear. When he discovered Brenner's background, Patterson found himself weighing military protocol against humanitarian necessity. Brenner first learned of the town's situation during evening roll call on December 19th. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, a former communications specialist from Hamburg, had overheard guards discussing the electrical crisis during his work detail in the camp's administrative offices. Weber, 24 years old and fluent in English, served as an informal translator between the German prisoners and American personnel. Weber approached Brenner in the mess hall that evening, speaking quietly in German, while 300 other prisoners consumed their dinner of beef stew, bread and coffee. Klaus, they say the American town has no electricity. The hospital cannot function properly. There may be deaths, Weber reported, his voice carrying unusual urgency. Brenner paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Throughout his 18 months in captivity, he had maintained strict adherence to military discipline, refusing to engage with American personnel beyond what regulations required. However, the image of a hospital operating without power troubled him deeply. His younger sister had died in a Munich hospital in 1937 when equipment failure prevented proper treatment during a routine surgery. That night, lying on his cot in Barracks 12, Brenner stared at the ceiling while 49 other men slept around him. The barracks, heated by coal-burning stoves, reminded him constantly of the infrastructure that made survival possible. He understood transformer design better than most American engineers, having spent years developing high-efficiency units for German factories. The knowledge felt both precious and useless, trapped behind regulations and national boundaries. The next morning, December 20th, brought news that crystallized Brenner's decision. Dr. Mitchell had sent word through official channels that 2 elderly patients had died during the night, likely from complications related to the lack of proper heating and medical equipment. The hospital's backup generator had failed after 3 days of continuous operation, leaving the facility completely without power. Through Weber's translation, Brenner requested a meeting with Colonel Patterson. The request itself violated unwritten protocol. Prisoners typically communicated through established chains of command, not directly with senior officers. However, Patterson, a practical man who had served in World War I and understood the human cost of rigid adherence to rules, agreed to the meeting. They met in Patterson's office at 2 o'clock that afternoon, with Weber serving as interpreter despite Brenner's adequate English. The office, heated by a wood-burning stove and lit by oil lamps, created an atmosphere that emphasized the gravity of their situation. "Colonel?" Brenner began in careful English, then switched to German while Weber translated. "I understand there is a transformer failure in your town. I have extensive experience with such equipment. I could examine the damage and possibly suggest a solution." Patterson studied the German officer across his desk. At 32, Brenner displayed the bearing of a professional engineer rather than a combat soldier, precise in his movements, thoughtful in his expressions, wearing his prisoner's uniform with the same attention to detail he might have given to civilian clothing. "Hauptmann Brenner, you understand that prisoners of war cannot work on critical infrastructure," Patterson replied. "The regulations are clear on this point." "Sir," Brenner continued through Weber, "if I may speak frankly, the regulations were written to prevent sabotage. I am not suggesting work that would benefit any military objective. I am suggesting humanitarian assistance to prevent further loss of civilian life." The conversation continued for 47 minutes, with Patterson weighing regulations against the mounting crisis in town. Finally, he reached a decision that would later be investigated by military inspectors, but ultimately vindicated by results. "I will authorize you to examine the transformer," Patterson announced. "However, you will work under constant guard supervision, and any repairs must be approved by qualified American personnel." The next challenge involved finding qualified American personnel. Hearn's only licensed electrician, 63-year-old Robert Hayes, had limited experience with high-voltage transformers. The nearest electrical engineer worked in Houston, 147 miles away, and travel during wartime required permits that could take weeks to obtain. On the morning of December 21st, Brenner arrived at the transformer station under escort by Sergeant Michael O'Brien and 2 armed guards. The facility, located behind the Hearn Municipal Building, housed equipment that had served reliably for 6 years before the lightning strike caused cascading failures throughout the primary electrical system. Brenner examined the damaged transformer with the methodical approach of a professional engineer. The unit's external casing showed scorch marks from electrical arcing, while internal inspection revealed melted copper windings and damaged insulation materials. However, his trained eye identified damage patterns suggesting that much of the transformer remained functional. "The primary coil is damaged beyond repair," Brenner explained to O'Brien through Weber. However, the secondary coils and the transformer core appear intact. If we can bypass the damaged sections and create temporary connections, we might restore partial power until replacement parts arrive. O'Brien, a 30-year-old technical sergeant from Chicago with electrical training from his pre-war job at Commonwealth Edison, understood enough to recognize the complexity of Brenner's proposal. The plan required precise calculations to prevent overloading the remaining functional components while maintaining safe voltage levels for the town's electrical grid. Over the next 6 hours, Brenner worked alongside Hayes and O'Brien to develop a repair strategy. The language barrier complicated technical discussions, but engineering drawings and mathematical calculations transcended national boundaries. Weber translated rapidly between German and English, while the three men sketched circuit diagrams and calculated power loads. The proposed solution required materials that were scarce in wartime Texas: high-grade copper wire, electrical insulation capable of withstanding kilovolt-level voltages, and specialized connectors rated for transformer applications. However, Brenner suggested improvising using materials available locally, including copper tubing from a closed brewery and insulation materials from farm equipment suppliers. By evening, they had developed a plan that could restore approximately 60% of the transformer's capacity, enough to power the hospital, telephone exchange, and several critical businesses. However, the work would require 12 to 14 hours of precise electrical work, most of it performed at dangerous voltage levels. Patterson faced another difficult decision. Military regulations prohibited prisoners from working unsupervised on infrastructure, but the technical complexity of the repair exceeded the capabilities of available American personnel. After consulting with his superiors by telephone, Patterson received authorization to proceed under extraordinary circumstances. December 22nd dawned clear and cold, with temperatures holding steady at 31 degrees. Brenner began work at 6 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by Hayes, O'Brien, and a rotating shift of guards who maintained constant vigilance while allowing him freedom to work. The repair process required dismantling sections of the transformer while maintaining safety protocols that prevented electrocution or equipment damage. Brenner's expertise became evident as he identified shortcuts and modifications that reduced both time requirements and material costs. His suggestions for temporary connections demonstrated engineering knowledge that impressed even skeptical American observers. Dr. Mitchell visited the work site at noon, bringing coffee and sandwiches for the repair team. She spoke briefly with Brenner, expressing gratitude for his efforts on behalf of the community. "Doctor," Brenner replied in his careful English, "in Germany, or in America, people need medical care. This is not about countries, this is about humanity." As word of the repair effort spread through Hearn, residents began gathering near the transformer station. By mid-afternoon, nearly 200 people stood behind barriers erected by local police, watching a German prisoner of war work to restore their electricity. The scene created unusual tensions between gratitude and suspicion, with some townspeople questioning the wisdom of relying on enemy expertise. Among the observers was Margaret Foster, a 45-year-old schoolteacher whose husband served with the Pacific Fleet. Foster initially felt conflicted about accepting help from a German soldier, but her practical nature overcame ideological concerns. "If he can fix our power so the children can have lights for Christmas, I don't care what uniform he used to wear," she told her neighbor, Mrs. Helen Crawford. The most challenging aspect of the repair involved reconnecting the transformer to the main distribution panel without triggering protective systems throughout the electrical grid. Brenner worked with mathematical precision, calculating voltage drops and current flows to ensure that restored power would reach its destinations without causing additional equipment failures. At 4:37 in the afternoon, Brenner completed the final connections and stepped back from the transformer housing. Hayes and O'Brien conducted safety checks while Brenner reviewed his calculations one last time. The moment of truth arrived when Hayes activated the main breaker that would restore power to downtown Hearn. The transformer hummed to life with a low electrical vibration that signaled successful operation. Streetlights flickered on throughout the downtown district, followed by illumination in store windows, office buildings, and residential areas served by the main distribution line. A cheer erupted from the gathered crowd as Hearn emerged from 4 days of darkness. Dr. Mitchell immediately telephoned the hospital to confirm that electrical power had been restored to all critical medical equipment. The emergency generator that had been limping along on its last reserves finally shut down as normal operations resumed. Within an hour, the hospital reported stable power to operating rooms, patient care areas, and diagnostic equipment. The restored electricity arrived just in time for Christmas preparations that had been suspended during the blackout. Local businesses reopened their doors, children resumed holiday activities that required lighting, and families began cooking Christmas dinners that would have been impossible without reliable power. However, the most significant impact occurred at the telephone exchange, where restored communications reconnected Hearn with the outside world. Families called relatives to report that the crisis had ended, businesses contacted suppliers to resume suspended operations, and local officials coordinated with state authorities to prevent similar emergencies in the future. That evening, Colonel Patterson received a telephone call from Brigadier General Harold Morrison, commanding officer of the 8th Service Command, responsible for prisoner of war operations in Texas. Morrison had learned of the day's events through official channels and wanted to discuss the implications of using prisoner expertise for civilian infrastructure repairs. "Colonel Patterson," Morrison began, "I understand you authorized a German prisoner to work on electrical equipment serving the local community." "Yes, sir," Patterson replied. "Under extraordinary circumstances, following consultations with appropriate authorities. Were you aware that this action could set a precedent that affects prisoner of war policies throughout the service command?" Patterson paused before responding. "Sir, I was aware that unusual circumstances required unusual solutions. The alternative was allowing preventable civilian casualties to continue." The conversation continued for 28 minutes, with Morrison ultimately concluding that Patterson had acted within the bounds of reasonable military judgment. However, the incident prompted a review of policies governing prisoner expertise in civilian emergencies, leading to guidelines that would influence similar situations throughout the remainder of the conflict. Christmas Eve in Hearn brought the town's first fully illuminated holiday celebration since before the transformer failure. The Methodist Church held evening services under electric lighting, local businesses extended their hours to accommodate last-minute shoppers, and families gathered for dinners prepared with the assistance of modern appliances. At Camp Hearn, Brenner spent Christmas Eve writing letters to his family in Germany, describing his recent experiences in carefully worded language that would pass military censors. His letter to his mother mentioned helping with electrical work, but avoided details that might compromise military security or violate correspondence regulations. "I have had the opportunity to use my engineering knowledge for peaceful purposes," Brenner wrote. "It reminds me that technical skills can serve humanity regardless of political circumstances. I hope this conflict ends soon so that engineers on all sides can return to building rather than destroying." The letter would take 6 weeks to reach Munich through international postal systems, arriving after Brenner's mother had received official notification that her son remained in good health as a prisoner of war in the United States. Dr. Mitchell used Christmas Day to catch up on medical procedures that had been delayed during the electrical emergency. With full power restored to the hospital, she performed 2 surgeries that had been postponed, treated several patients who had suffered complications during the blackout, and resumed normal operations that served not only Hearn, but surrounding rural areas that depended on the facility. Local newspapers covered the story of the German engineers' assistance, though wartime censorship prevented detailed reporting until after the conflict ended. The Hearn Democrat published a brief article on December 28th, noting that local electrical problems have been resolved through the cooperation of various personnel without identifying Brenner by name or nationality. The transformer repair held throughout the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. Replacement parts finally arrived in March 1945, allowing for permanent repairs that restored the unit to full capacity. However, Brenner's temporary solution had prevented what could have been months of electrical problems during the coldest period of the year. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, Camp Hearn began preparing for the eventual repatriation of its prisoners. The process would take nearly 2 years to complete, with prisoners returning to Germany based on complex formulas involving capture dates, medical conditions, and family circumstances. Brenner received repatriation orders in August 1946, nearly 2 years after his Christmas electrical work. Before departing Texas, he requested permission to visit downtown Hearn one final time, wanting to see the transformer that had occupied such a significant place in his prisoner of war experience. Colonel Patterson, who remained at Camp Hearn throughout the repatriation process, authorized the visit under guard supervision. Brenner spent 30 minutes examining the permanent repairs that had replaced his emergency modifications, expressing satisfaction that the installation met professional engineering standards. During this final visit, Dr. Mitchell approached Brenner to thank him personally for his assistance during the electrical crisis. Their conversation, conducted in English with occasional assistance from Weber, focused on the universal nature of technical knowledge and humanitarian concern. "Hauptmann Brenner," Dr. Mitchell said, "I wanted you to know that your work prevented several deaths that winter. Medical emergencies don't wait for convenient times, and your expertise made the difference between life and death for some of my patients," Brenner replied quietly. "Dr. Mitchell, I am pleased that my knowledge could serve a useful purpose. In Germany, I designed electrical systems for factories and schools. Here in Texas, I helped repair electrical systems for hospitals and schools. The work is the same regardless of the country." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it represented a moment of human connection that transcended the political boundaries that had brought them together under such unusual circumstances. Brenner departed Texas on August 15, 1946, as part of a group of 237 repatriated prisoners traveling by train to New York for shipment to Germany. His personal possessions included technical notebooks filled with observations about American electrical systems, correspondence with his family, and a letter of commendation from Colonel Patterson acknowledging his assistance during the Hearn electrical emergency. Upon returning to Germany, Brenner found Munich devastated by years of bombing and ground combat. The electrical infrastructure that he had helped design before the conflict lay in ruins, requiring complete reconstruction. His expertise in power systems made him valuable in reconstruction efforts, though the work of rebuilding proved more challenging than any wartime engineering project. In 1948, Brenner established an electrical engineering consulting firm specializing in power distribution systems for industrial facilities. His company grew slowly during Germany's reconstruction period, eventually employing 43 engineers and technicians who worked throughout Central Europe on electrical infrastructure projects. The techniques that Brenner had developed for emergency transformer repairs in Texas proved valuable during Germany's reconstruction, when replacement parts remained scarce and improvised solutions were often necessary. His experience working with limited materials and tight time constraints translated directly to the challenges of rebuilding a nation's electrical grid with inadequate resources. Dr. Mitchell continued practicing medicine in Hearn until her retirement in 1968, serving 3 generations of families in the community. She often told the story of the German prisoner who restored power for Christmas 1944, emphasizing the importance of technical knowledge in serving humanitarian purposes regardless of political circumstances. The hospital that benefited from Brenner's electrical work expanded significantly during the post-war years, eventually serving a patient population of over 15,000 people throughout East Central Texas. Modern electrical systems installed during renovation projects in the 1960s incorporated safety features and redundancy measures that prevented the kind of catastrophic failures that had threatened the facility in 1944. Camp Hearn closed permanently in 1946 after the completion of prisoner repatriation operations. The facility's buildings were sold to civilian buyers, with some structures converted to agricultural use and others demolished for construction materials. Today, a historical marker indicates the location where 4,700 German prisoners lived and worked during their captivity in Texas. The transformer that Brenner repaired served Hearn faithfully until 1973, when growth in the community's electrical demand required installation of a larger unit. The original transformer, manufactured by Westinghouse in 1938 and repaired by a German prisoner of war in 1944, was donated to a technical museum in Houston, where it remains on display with a plaque describing its role in an unusual chapter of World War II history. In 1965, 21 years after the Christmas electrical emergency, Brenner received an unexpected letter from Hearne, Texas. Margaret Foster, the schoolteacher who had watched him work on the transformer, wrote to express the community's continued gratitude for his assistance during a critical time. Foster's letter, forwarded through international postal services and German government offices, eventually reached Brenner's engineering firm in Munich. She reported that the town had prospered during the post-war years, that Dr. Mitchell remained in good health and continued practicing medicine, and that the electrical systems installed after the war provided reliable service to a growing community. Brenner replied with a letter, thanking the community for their acceptance of his assistance during wartime circumstances. He described his post-war career in electrical engineering, his role in Germany's reconstruction efforts, and his continued belief that technical knowledge should serve humanitarian purposes whenever possible. The correspondence between Brenner and Foster continued sporadically for nearly a decade, bridging the gap between former enemies who had found common ground in shared humanity and practical problem-solving. Their letters, preserved in local historical archives, document an unusual friendship that grew from extraordinary wartime circumstances. When Brenner died in Munich in 1982 at the age of 70, his obituary in German engineering publications mentioned his contributions to industrial electrical systems throughout Central Europe. However, it made no reference to his wartime service or his role in restoring power to a Texas town during Christmas 1944, a story that remained largely unknown, except to those who had witnessed it personally. The legacy of Brenner's emergency electrical work extended beyond the immediate restoration of power to Hearne. His successful collaboration with American engineers under extraordinary circumstances influenced military policies governing the use of prisoner expertise in civilian emergencies, leading to more flexible guidelines that balanced security concerns with humanitarian needs. Military historians studying prisoner of war policies during World War II have identified the Hearne electrical incident as an example of practical problem-solving that transcended political boundaries during wartime. The case study is often cited in discussions of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention provisions regarding prisoner labor and civilian assistance. The town of Hearne grew significantly during the decades following World War II, eventually reaching a population of over 8,000 residents, supported by diversified agriculture, light manufacturing, and service industries. Reliable electrical service, taken for granted by newer residents, remained essential to the community's economic development and quality of life. Local historians have preserved accounts of the 1944 electrical emergency, including interviews with survivors who remembered the 4 days of darkness before Christmas and the unusual circumstances that led to the power restoration. These oral histories provide detailed perspectives on how the crisis affected daily life and how community attitudes toward the German prisoner evolved during the emergency. The story of Klaus Brenner's transformer repair represents one of countless individual acts of technical skill and human compassion that occurred during World War II, often unrecorded and forgotten as larger events dominated historical attention. However, for the residents of Hearne, Texas, his expertise made the difference between a dark Christmas and a celebration illuminated by restored hope and unexpected cooperation. Today, Hearne's electrical grid draws power from multiple sources through redundant distribution systems that prevent the kind of catastrophic failure that threatened the community in 1944. Modern technology and improved infrastructure have eliminated many of the vulnerabilities that once made small towns dependent on single points of failure in their electrical systems. Yet the fundamental lesson of Brenner's Christmas repair remains relevant. Technical expertise, human compassion, and practical problem-solving can transcend political boundaries and national identities when circumstances require cooperation for humanitarian purposes. In a world often divided by ideology and conflict, the story of a German prisoner of war who lit up a Texas town for Christmas offers a reminder that shared humanity can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. The transformer station where Brenner worked in 1944 has been modernized multiple times, with current equipment bearing little resemblance to the 1938 Westinghouse unit that failed during the December lightning storm. However, a small plaque installed by the Hearn Historical Society acknowledges the location where an act of technical cooperation during wartime demonstrated the universal value of engineering knowledge applied for humanitarian purposes. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.